Have you ever noticed how you sometimes don't correct people? They misunderstand you, your intentions, your silence, your choices, and instead of stepping in, you just let it sit there, unfixed, unclarified, almost on purpose. And maybe, if you're being honest, there's a strange comfort in it, because being understood would mean explaining, and explaining would mean revealing, and revealing, well, that feels like giving something away you're not ready to lose. So you stay quiet. You let them think what they want. And from the outside, it looks like passivity, indifference, maybe even weakness. But here's the hidden truth. Sometimes, choosing to be misunderstood is one of the most deliberate psychological decisions a person can make. By the end of this, you might realize it's not that you can't be understood. It's that, in certain moments, you don't want to be. Let's start with a familiar kind of silence. You're in a conversation, someone misreads your tone, assumes something about you that isn't quite right, not offensive enough to fight, not accurate enough to accept, and yet, you let it go. This is the first archetype, the selective simplifier. These are people who have learned, often the hard way, that being fully understood is exhausting. It requires constant translation of your inner world into something digestible for others, and not everyone deserves that effort. So instead, they simplify themselves, not by lying, but by withholding complexity. Psychologically, this often stems from cognitive economy, the brain's tendency to conserve energy. Explaining yourself repeatedly, especially to people who don't truly listen, feels like pouring water into a sieve. Eventually, you stop pouring. And here's the subtle shift. Misunderstanding becomes less of a problem and more of a filter. If someone misjudges you based on a fragment, it tells you something about them, their assumptions, their limits, their willingness or unwillingness to look deeper. And maybe you've thought this before. If they really wanted to understand me, they would. But then, there's a different kind of quiet. This one isn't about conserving energy. It's about protecting identity. Imagine being someone who has spent years being misread, labeled too quiet, too intense, too distant, maybe even hard to understand. At first, you tried to correct it, explain yourself, adjust. But over time, something shifts. You begin to internalize the distance, not as a flaw, but as a boundary. This is the second archetype, the guarded individualist. For them, being misunderstood becomes a form of psychological armor, because being fully understood means being fully seen, and being fully seen opens the door to judgment, rejection, or worse, being reduced to something simpler than what you are. So they keep parts of themselves private, not hidden out of fear, but preserved out of respect. Psychologically, this aligns with identity protection theory. When people feel that their true self might be misinterpreted or devalued, they instinctively restrict access to it. And here's where it gets interesting. To an outsider, this can look like aloofness, coldness, even arrogance. But internally, it's often the opposite. It's a deep awareness that not everyone is equipped to hold the full weight of who you are. So instead of shrinking yourself to be understood, you allow yourself to be partially misunderstood. Because partial misunderstanding is safer than full misrepresentation. Now, here's where it becomes a little more paradoxical. Some people don't just tolerate being misunderstood, they prefer it. This is the third archetype, the quiet rebel. They move differently, think differently, choose paths that don't quite make sense to the average observer, and instead of explaining those choices, they let the confusion linger. Why? Because explanation invites conformity. The moment you justify your decisions, You're subtly aligning them with shared logic, social approval, familiar narratives. But for the quiet rebel, that defeats the point. Their identity is built around deviation, and being misunderstood becomes a signal that they are, in fact, not blending in. Psychologically, this ties into the need for autonomy, the desire to define oneself independently of external validation. So when people don't get them, it's not a problem, it's confirmation. You might recognize this in moments where you've made a decision that didn't make sense to others, but felt undeniably right to you. And instead of defending it, you just moved forward. Because deep down, you knew that explaining it would dilute it. But then, there's a softer version of this behavior, less defiant, more introspective. This is the fourth archetype, the emotional minimalist. These are people who feel deeply, but express selectively. They've learned that not every emotion needs to be externalized. Not every experience needs to be shared. So when someone misunderstands their silence, their distance, or their calm, they don't rush to correct it. Because for them, meaning isn't always meant to be visible. Psychologically, this can be linked to emotional regulation and internal processing styles. Some individuals simply process emotions inwardly, constructing meaning privately rather than collaboratively. And here's the nuance. They're not disconnected. They're just not broadcasting. So when someone says, "You're hard to read," it's not entirely wrong, but it's also not a flaw. It's a preference, a quieter way of existing in a world that often rewards constant expression. So what does all of this mean? Why would someone choose, consciously or not, to be misunderstood? Because understanding is not neutral. It comes with expectations, labels, projections. The moment someone believes they understand you, they begin to define you. And sometimes, that definition feels more limiting than the misunderstanding itself. So you leave parts of yourself undefined, untranslated, unexplained. Not because you lack clarity, but because you value it too much to hand it over casually. Now here's the question that lingers. When you stay silent while being misunderstood, is it because you're protecting your energy or protecting your identity? Are you avoiding unnecessary explanations or avoiding being seen? And more importantly, if someone truly tried to understand you, without assumptions, without simplifications, would you let them? Or would you still keep a part of yourself just out of reach? Maybe the real psychology isn't about wanting to be misunderstood. Maybe it's about choosing who gets to understand you and who doesn't. If this resonates more than you expected, there's probably a reason for that. You can leave your thoughts below. What's a moment where you chose not to correct a misunderstanding? And if you're drawn to these quieter, less obvious patterns of human behavior, you already know where this conversation is going next. All right, thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to explore more topics like this in the next videos.